listen to the recording, have to listen to our intros, but thankfully not, so that's good. Ian, are you able to share your screen? That's pretty good, but we can see the outline. There we go, perfect. All right, thank you so much for coming to this meeting today. Ian and I are very into this project, so we are excited to be presenting this to you today. It is about the Bird-friendliness Index. We call an outcome-based indicator of conservation impact. And I want to already thank Barry and Janine very much for all the work that they have put into this. Without you guys, we would not be talking here today, so thank you. Next slide, please. So grasslands are in peril, as you all know, and we think that with this index, we can help to answer two questions that we think are relevant. The first one is, the first one pertains to the grasslands we still have, and that is, can we help inform the management so the remaining grasslands are managed for the best outcomes for grassland birds? So in other ways, can we use it as an indicator that tells us whether all the things we do to benefit grassland birds actually have the desired outcome? The second question that we think we can help to answer relates to the grasslands that we are losing. And so we know, of course, that there is a gap in both the revenue and the risk between grass-based production systems and annual crop production system, which drives the loss, the conversion. And so the question then is, can we incentivize biodiverse production systems or grasslands to slow that conversion? Next slide, please. So the index is about birds. However, we feel quite confident that it is fair to make this about more than just birds and talk about grassland biodiversity in general for a few reasons, which I trust will resonate with you. Birds are, of course, indicators of overall ecosystem health. They have long-term trend data, which more so than really any other taxa out there. They are easily detected. They are also much cheaper to monitor than other taxa. And of course, people relate to birds. So these are all important reasons. And so when we say it's good for birds, there is a certain extension we can make to say it's actually good for all of biodiversity. And, there are studies that back that up, of course. Next slide, please. So this being the audience that it is, we decided to spend more time on the science and methods than we usually do. But I'm going to hand it over to Ian now, who will explain to you how the indicator is calculated and the first, how our first season. So Ian, please take it away.
Great, thanks, Silke. So as you all know, and as Silke has mentioned, one of these avenues that we're exploring to be able to contribute to grassland conservation and really improving biodiversity and birds in the agroecosystem is this Bird-friendliness Index. So again, this is an outcome-based indicator that looks to represent the impact of management on a bird community. And that's typically in the context that we're using it at a farm or ranch level, but it can also be extended to conservation areas or fee simple lands owned by land trusts, that sort of thing. So this was originally developed by a group of researchers led by Nicole Michael at the Audubon Society. And some of you might be sort of familiar with this, at least peripherally, from its inclusion within their conservation ranching initiative in the US. But as Silke mentioned, over the last couple of years, Birds Canada, along with our partners, primarily Janine and Barry at the Canadian Wildlife Service, have been looking at adapting this to the Canadian context as a potential tool for producers and conservation organizations to be able to measure the impact that they're having on birds and biodiversity as represented by that bird community. And then by being able to communicate that impact to a number of different stakeholders throughout a supply chain, for instance, this could help enable some market and policy tools to be able to provide some fair compensation for that biodiversity that's being provided, particularly by grass-based production systems. So I'm going to do a fairly high-level overview of some of the key components of the Bird-friendliness Index before we go into how it's measured in detail. I will mention that both Janine and Barry are here for the Q&A session to answer any more of the more technical questions that you might have that Silke or I might not be able to answer. So we'll start with a high-level overview and then kind of dig into the details from there. So first of all, again, this is an outcome-based indicator that's using only the bird inputs to create this outcome of the bird community representation. So at its core and at its base, the bird friendliness index is essentially calculated by taking the sum weighted densities, multiplying by the functional diversity at this stage. So sum weighted densities by the diversity multiplied by the diversity component. And we'll dig into that more a bit later. But then it's also measured, another key component is that it's measured at a farm scale. So as you approach 1, it's scale between 0 and 1. And so as you approach 1, that means, you know, that farm or ranch or that site is better for birds than the background bird community, and is that background bird community condition is represented by 0.5. So a farm will receive a score relative to that 0.5 that's representing sort of the background community condition. And then whether they're above that 0.5 or below means that they're either better than sort of the average or below average. So to expand on that a little bit, the bird friendliness index then has a standardization built into the way that you calculate this, and it's standardized to the surrounding landscape, which gives us a relative comparison between what's going on the surrounding landscape and those farms and ranches that we're measuring birds on. So farms have bird data collected on them to represent the bird community on the farm. And then there are bird data sources that are used to also represent the bird community in the surrounding landscape or within the stratum that those farms are located in. And again, that surrounding landscape data, bird data, represents that background bird community condition in the surrounding landscape, and that's represented by a 0.5 bird friendliness index score. And our farms are then scaled to that surrounding landscape. So what this standardization does is that it's designed in large part to mitigate the effects that are outside, mitigate effects caused by factors that are outside of a land manager's control. So we're dealing with migratory birds. There are things that affect them. So for instance, a ranch won't be penalized for a natural population decline due to drought conditions within their stratum, because it's likely that those drought conditions are affecting that stratum in a similar way as that farm. So this again results in sort of that effective relative comparison to be able to home in on what impact the management systems that are employed by those land managers are having upon the bird communities on those participating farms. So that's kind of the overview of some of the key components. So obviously to adapt this to the Canadian context, we need to go out and we need to do some bird surveys. And we've undertaken a fairly large effort over the last 2 years with some partners in order to ultimately support this. So we've done over 3,300 total survey stations in Manitoba and Saskatchewan over the last 2 years, representing over 340,000 unique acres over those 2 years, and 78 unique sites, which span, again, from farms and ranches to crown lands to fee simple lands owned by land trusts. So to get into some of our field methods a little bit in terms of how we collect that bird data on those sites, we have 2 different methods of collecting that data, but overarching that is we're trying to get a representative sample of each site. So we're covering 20 to 75% of the total area of a site, depending on its size and which size category it fits into. And then we do either in-person point counts, where we send out staff to do 5-minute intervals where all the birds are identified either by sight or sound and marked down. And then we also employ removal sampling, where the 5-minute point count is divided into 1-minute intervals, and the first detection of each bird is recorded in the interval that it occurs. We're also keeping track of whether that's oral or visual detections. And then we also use 3 distance categories to enable distance sampling, STO 0 to 50, etc. We're also deploying autonomous recording units as part of our bird data collection. These are programmed to sample both in the morning and at night, although the night recordings at this stage are not contributing to the bird friendliness index, so we won't spend too much time on that. But the morning recordings are programmed to do a 5-minute recording, sort of replicating that 5-minute point count. And then they start, and in that dawn chorus period, starting a half hour before sunrise, and then recording a 5-minute recording every half hour until 3 hours after sunrise. And then we select a random recording from each of one of those points, and then it's screened for proper weather conditions and sound quality, and then uploaded to Wild Tracks, where we have staff or contractors that then process those recordings. So incorporating the ARUs has been really interesting. And again, Barry and Janine have been really integral to being able to incorporate that data within our analysis and be able to use that data. So it's been really, really interesting. And it also provides some flexibility on how much data we can collect. So, which is really nice in terms of having bad weather days, we can still deploy recorders and all those sorts of things. Just to, one of the goals as us as a conservation organization, obviously, is to engage with these producers that are keeping grass intact and are hosting these birds on their places. So it's been really fun and a rewarding process to engage with a lot of these producers, and we provide, and as part of that, we provide reports to them, summarizing all the different birds that we found, highlighting species at risk or interesting birds, and then also providing them with some habitat and ID information for some of those birds. And again, that's been really neat, and it's been a really good learning experience, I think, for both us as Birds Canada and also for the producers, and kind of knowledge sharing there. So now that we've got all the bird data on the farms collected, let's get back into sort of the nuts and bolts of how this is actually calculated. So we're taking all of the birds that we detected through those surveys, and then we're using the regional conservation scores from the Avian Conservation Database and multiplying each one of those birds by their conservation score, and then summing that all up to get our sum weighted densities. And then we multiply those sum weighted densities by the functional diversity that we've calculated, which is currently based on a Shannon's index. And then that gives us a raw bird friendliness index score, which is then rescaled to be a score between 0 and 1. And this is done through a logistically transformed rescaling, essentially. And if you have questions about that, Janine and Barry would probably be the best people to talk to about that. But so we needed to come up with a bird species list that we were going to focus on. So some of the criteria that we used was that it needs to have breeding habitat in our breeding territories in Canada and BCR 11, and then have a primary or secondary breeding habitat as one of those grassland habitats listed there. At this time, we've excluded waterfowl, raptors, and grouse because they're not well detected by our survey methods, and we also excluded introduced species. So that leaves us with a species list of 19 species listed there. And then the last sort of portion of this, in order to get that scaling, is that you need to be able to compare those farms and ranches to this surrounding landscape and have a data source for that. So Here in Canada, of course, we lack a large scale off-road bird surveying program to be able to utilize as that data source. They use the IMBCR in the States, but we don't have that here currently. So to fill that data need, we're using the Canadian Wildlife Services bird density models to represent that bird community in the surrounding landscape in this initial analysis. In the initial analysis, we're also using stratification of ecoregion and province. And through our work over the last 2 years, we had 3 different strata that are listed there. So we're currently, working through the calculating and tweaking of the bird friendliness index and have some really very early preliminary results. There's been a lot of work that's been done up to this stage already in order to adapt the bird friendliness index to the Canadian context, and ensuring that it is robust and effective in this landscape. And there's going to continue to be more work to be done through this winter and over the next few years. So and we just want to make sure that we're doing our due diligence so that it could be applied in some of these applications that we're talking about, like contributing to market and policy tools. So I will just echo quickly Silke's sentiments. First of all, thank you to Nicole Michael, who's been involved with this process variously, and also Dr. Ryan Fisher from the Royal Saskatchewan Museum, who served on the Bird Friendliness Index Working Group. And again, a big thank you to Janine McManus and Barry Robinson, who are here, who, as Silke mentioned, have done a lot of the heavy, or almost all of the main statistical design and all that sort of thing. And without them, we wouldn't be where we are at. So with that, I will pass it back to you, Silke, and carry on.
All right, so what do we see as the potential applications of the Bird Friendliness Index in Canada? The first one is it can serve as an indicator, we think, to help stakeholders evaluate the impact of what they do on the land on bird biodiversity. So that is for, the land that we have. The other one is to set goals and track progress towards your biodiversity goals. And so I'm very happy to say that the Canadian Roundtable for Sustainable Beef just adopted the Bird Friendliness Index as one of the avenues to achieve the scoring the ranchers need for their biodiversity indicators. So that's exciting. The Bird Friendliness Index, we think, can also be used to incentivize grassland conservation. And so if you flip to the next slide, Ian, I'm going to say a little bit more about that. So the next steps here are as follows. We are very happy to know, we're very happy that we just got a second round of funding from Priority Places for this project. So it'll continue until 2025. We'll continue with the analytical and the modeling work. And so in terms of implementation, we'll work with the CSP producers, and we are going to seek avenues to incentivize biodiverse production systems. And so the way we can see this work is a funding agency, for example, could decide, yes, biodiversity is important to us. We are going to ensure that any project we fund meets a certain biodiversity criteria as measured by the Bird Friendliness Index. Same with lending agencies. We had preliminary discussions with Farm Credit Canada. So they could decide that they offer reduced lending rates for biodiverse production systems. So there then is a financial incentive to maintain grasslands as opposed to converting land to croplands. The same could be said for supply chains. And of course, this could be playing a role in the halt and reverse biodiversity loss, which our government has committed to. So if ECCC or AFC wanted to know, well, are the things that we're doing actually having an impact on biodiversity? So then the Bird Friendliness Index could play a role in measuring that progress. So we are continuing these discussions that we have, and we are at the end of the presentation. And if we have time, I would love to pick your brain to hear your thoughts about this. But I also know you have other things on the agenda for today. So for now, maybe I'll just thank you all for your attention, and I'll let you look at all the sponsors that we had to make this work happen. And I will be quiet now and invite a discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Silke and Ian. We do have a lot of time still if folks are able to stick around and participate. The future agenda items, many of them won't take too long anyway, so we do have lots of time. So with that, I'll invite any questions, comments.
Yeah, I have a few questions. That was really interesting to hear. So thanks for coming and presenting that. Just a couple, I guess, questions. Have you all developed any or have a sense of any recommendations for how to implement the monitoring? I mean, not every ranch will have an opportunity to monitor birds every year. In fact, a lot of times they might just have one chance to go out there and collect data. That can obviously affect what birds are found, if it's a good year or bad year. Do you have any like general recommendations for, you have to monitor 2 or 3 years minimum to have that amount of data to provide a robust sort of assessment of abundance?
Yeah, so I think, thanks for the question, Arvin. I think the way that we've been kind of thinking about it is, similar to what you're saying. Obviously, you're not going to be able to get out and do bird surveys every year on a farm or ranch, just for even from a, if you're looking to scale this up and from a cost perspective, that's not going to really be possible. So it's more likely going to be on a bit of a rotation. Hopefully, every, sort of 3 years is kind of what we're thinking about right now, but that's kind of just an initial sort of thought that follows similarly to what Audubon is doing within their conservation and ranching initiative, but there are some slightly different goals there as well. But again, sort of to your point about being able to, whether it's a good year or a bad year, that's kind of part of the reason is going this approach with the bird friendliness index, and that relative comparison is that hopefully you're able to take some of that out of, or some of that sort of out of the whole thing, because you're getting that relative comparison and sort of mitigating some of those effects of climatic conditions, that, and instead looking at what the impacts of the management were. So that's kind of one of the things that hopefully will mitigate some of that concern. So
right, and so does one need to have a concurrent sort of background monitoring program in place to be able to evaluate across years, or to have that context from the same year of the surveys? Is that so? Is the whole thing sort of operating on the same sort of periodicity then of like 3 years with the background monitoring also the 3 years, or is it sort of more just taking advantage of whatever background monitoring might exist, or
yeah, so right now we're looking at sort of taking advantage of what background monitoring might exist. So again, using the models that and the initial analysis, using the models that Barry's developed, those bird density models, and using that as that data source for the background. And then also exploring some potential other avenues for that background data, ranging from using potentially breeding bird surveys or a sort of a contemporary large scale large off-road survey. But right now in the initial stages here, we're sort of evaluating how those models might be able to use as sort of an annual data source for that background data.
Interesting. Yeah, I'm of course thinking of all this through the lens of the program I operate in northern Mexico. We have about 35 ranches right now enrolled. We're doing monitoring on them every year. As every new ranch gets enrolled, it becomes more and more costly and more effort needed to tackle all that monitoring. we did have just a couple of years of some background monitoring that's beyond the ranches that we're working on. So we have that for 2 years, consecutive years. But again, it's like, yeah, when we'll have another opportunity to collect that type of data, is not clear. So I'd love to be able to use this there, but I don't know if I have all the pieces from, to continue. I mean, you could probably do it for a number of the ranches we have, but, as we're adding 2 to 4 new ranches every year, it can be a challenge to keep up with. Of course, we'd love to. I think the information itself is ideal for sharing with landowners. It makes it simple to understand, and for comparing. I mean, create a little bit of competitiveness maybe with some of the landowners. So I think it has lots of great applications.
Yeah, it would.
I'd love to try it.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to continue that conversation a bit, Arvind, and maybe, talking to Janine and Barry about some of the challenges and the opportunities as far as using different background data sources and that sort of thing that might be available down there. So, yeah.
I can just add to that, Arvind, too, that, in an idealized world, I think, we kind of have been looking to IMBCR as a sort of our model, the design for monitoring. And if we scale this up, I think that would be ideal. Like if every ranch could have surveys every year, and you could have, off ranch surveys like you do for IMBCR as well to get that background information. But as you know, and I don't know if other people are familiar with IMBCR, integrated monitoring for bird conservation regions, and the way that they scale that up is you guys have so many partners, that help fund all that monitoring, whether it's states, state governments or NGOs or national forests and things like that. So that's kind of what we're thinking, in terms of how we, that would be an ideal way forward, if we could somehow create a Canadian version of IMBCR. But we just don't have the partners yet. And so we're kind of working on that. And as Ian said, to try and mitigate that problem, we're looking at various options. One is potentially using BBS data, which has a few issues that don't want to get into today. But then the density models that I create. So basically, what those, we can predict density for every species for every 800-meter pixel across, from Canada down to the Mexico border, and those can be extrapolated to a specific year because we use like weather covariates, and so that's what we're experimenting with doing that too. So, in theory, those models should be able to pick up on annual stochasticity in the populations, hopefully. So, like this year, for example, we had a huge Sprague's pipit crash up here in Canada. They're just almost non-existent across the landscape. And we'd hate to penalize a rancher because they didn't have any Sprague's pipits if no one else did either. So, but anyways, yeah, we're kind of just working toward that as we ramp this up.
Yeah. Yeah, in Mexico, it's similar. I mean, wintering grounds, of course, but there's no broad scale monitoring program that we could tap into. So we have to either do it ourselves every year, which is a lot of effort. And so trying to think of ways to make the monitoring more manageable so it doesn't overwhelm the other part of our work, cost wise and effort wise. We could be repeated every few years, or I mean, this kind of seems like cheating in some ways, but I've often thought about just trying to eliminate some of the weather stochasticity and just monitor in the good years when the birds are there. If you don't have that background to calibrate on, of course, then you're getting into being quite selective in what data you're looking at. But when the conditions are not good, the birds are simply not there, and you can spend a lot of money and time to go out there and say, oh, the birds are not there. And then what sense do you really have of whether they're doing bird-friendly management or not?
And then I can also say that there has been a lot of talk recently about producing winter density models for grassland birds, and your data, Arvind, would probably be the only data source we have there. The transect data, and so there's been a lot of talk about that with various working groups, and so that if we can potentially develop similar winter range models that try and quantify that annual stochasticity based on weather covariates, that might be one option too. So let's keep talking about that, and as we work with using our models for the background here up in Canada, we can see about applying that down in Mexico too.
Yeah, we've actually done some of that. with the weather stochasticity and the abundance. We're looking at what drives or how those weather variables affect shifts in abundance.
I have a question. What do you see so far in terms of what habitat management looks like it's the most bird friendly? So in other words, what are you finding that you want to encourage more of?
Yeah, it's pretty early days at this stage, but essentially the broad strokes, Douglas, is just essentially like keeping habitat intact, really, right? Like, so, and you know, in some ways, like Silke mentioned, we are at this stage sort of focusing on those broad strokes and being able to sort of communicate that these, you know, these sort of production systems are really important for birds and biodiversity, and being able to then have some sort of indicator to be able to, you know, sort of quantitatively communicate that throughout a supply chain to further incentivize some of those practices. So long answer to say we haven't dug in necessarily into some of those finer details of management systems and practices and that sort of thing at this stage, I'm afraid.
Okay, but why I asked was because I thought that it might be easier to keep track of what the range managers are doing rather than have to do annual bird monitoring, right? Once you establish what those relationships are between good habits and bad habits, then maybe it's easier to have them say, yes, we did this, or we didn't change anything, or whatever, versus we plowed everything under because we wanted to grow wheat this year, you know, that sort of thing.
Yeah, yeah, you're right. Although when you're thinking about maybe sort of like applying this, you know, outside of just the grassland context and more in a like broader agricultural context, and then, you know, a lot of what we do already is sort of practice-based conservation, which when you're looking at applying that on a large scale can sometimes become challenging, especially for, like, for instance, private corporations that might be looking to have some sort of way of, you know, insetting biodiversity within their supply chain. Using an outcome-based approach might actually be a little bit easier to manage for something like that, rather than having, you know, quite a long list of different practices that are, you know, regionally specific and all those sorts of things, and then instead kind of looking at, you know, an outcome index sort of like this that is useful in multiple different sort of production areas and production systems and all those sorts of things is kind of where our head is at with it, Doug, and applying it in that way. So yeah.
Okay, Tom?
Yeah, so I have a number of questions. I guess one of the questions is long range, and it's kind of like Doug's question, meaning assuming that the biodiversity index or the bird friendliness index has, you know, gets accepted as having a value for the producer, right? So that I mean, I guess one of my questions is there any sense that, I think your answer is going to be, well, it's too early to tell. Is there any sense in which private landowners get behind this and say, yeah, I really want to have a high biodiversity, a high bird friendly index because it's going to benefit me, the producer, in some way, as well as society? Maybe you know the answer to that, or, you know, maybe that's, and then the other set of questions I had to do with more questions about the value of the biodiversity index as a way of integrating different kinds of ideas about what makes a farm valuable for birds. I mean, I'll hold those questions, and maybe you could tackle the first one.
Sure. So yeah, you're right. Like the value in, like, when you're working in an agricultural landscape, a lot of it comes down to sort of economics, because they're that's what their small businesses operating on the landscape and need to be able to be profitable. But so there, but that's kind of the sort of the ultimate goal with this, is to be able to hopefully enable some of those market and policy tools that would sort of tie biodiversity potentially to some economic benefits. And so, you know, the producer feedback that we've had initially on it, and with the producers that we've been participating with, sometimes we're participating with partner projects and not necessarily signed up directly with Birds Canada. But when we do talk to them about this sort of approach, there is a lot of positive feedback, maybe more than I was anticipating. There seems to be a lot of recognition by producers that there are different outputs that, you know, society is going to want, and then having a way to be able to communicate that is going to be advantageous for them. Yeah, the initial sort of feedback that we've gotten through the Canadian Roundtable for Sustainable Beef and our involvement there has been really good, as well as other producers that we've been involved with. There seems to be a lot of, yeah, really positive feedback on the approach. So does that sort of answer your question, Tom?
Yeah, sort of. I mean, I worry it's a complex. I mean, the work behind getting that index is substantial. So I sure hope it becomes something that can be really have some conservation value in the end. So there's a lot of work, I know, that goes between developing a monitoring technique and assigning values between that and actually having it become something that society at large will value. And that's the real work. That's the tough part.
Yeah, just as a bit of a point there, Tom, it's interesting. Like, I was at a conference recently, and, you know, there's over 50% of sort of global operating companies that do have a biodiversity goal as part of their goals. So there's carbon, and then biodiversity is becoming increasingly one of those things that people are paying attention to, and in particular these large global corporations. And, you know, having a way to be able to measure that sort of scope 3 style throughout their supply chain, I think, is going to be really important for them being able to track and hit those goals. So yeah.
The other questions I had to do with the value itself, and you know, we've got an index between 0 and 1. When I think about say an individual farm and its benefit to birds, you know, it's not an easy question. So, and I see how, and I can't do the math in my head really quickly, but I see how we have some birds that are, quote, worth more than others because of their conservation, because of their PIF conservation number, right? So a rare bird that's in steep decline, for example, we care maybe more about that than we do about a widespread abundance bird. And I know the diversity index kind of has to sort of figure that out in some integrated way. But when you thought through how to do that and came upon, I think you said you used Simpson's diversity index or something like that. Did you?
Shannon's, yeah.
Yeah, the Shannon Weaver index. So I guess what I'm saying is, and you also talked about the background, you know, as being a way to evaluate whether something that's happening on a farm is happening because of factors that are out of the producer's control that he or she couldn't do anything about. But also, when I think about the value of a farm, an individual farm for conservation would be more valuable if, in addition to what it did on its acreage, there was potential to influence the area around it as well. So I'm thinking, you know, a farm that was completely, or a piece of native prairie that was completely surrounded by non-native alien habitat, whatever, wouldn't be as valuable as a farm that was in a matrix where there was some other opportunities to develop conservation programs. So you'd have a larger area of bird friendliness in the end. And is there a way to figure that into calculating that the value of that index value for an individual farm?
I'll see if I can answer this sort of effectively. I mean, a lot of the way that we're kind of coming about this, Tom, a little bit is to be able, like, the main thing that's driving grassland bird losses is the loss of habitat. And the thing that's driving that is the difference between the economics between annual crop production and keeping grass intact through beef production systems. So I guess, you know, that's kind of the frame of reference in which we're kind of coming at this. So that example that you used where you've got, you know, somebody that's holding on to native grass, but it's surrounded by cropland, we want to be able to somehow communicate how important that is in sort of a tangible way so that we can direct programming and incentives and so on to that producer, because it's likely that they're in an area that they're holding on that grass for, you know, to the detriment of their economic and financial situation, right? So I get kind of what you're saying, I think, in terms of being able to influence further beyond. And I think that it will in some stages and in some ways by being able to sort of the way that you stratify, right? So if you're in an area that has, you know, more grass in it, then those sort of management factors that into the actual management of the habitat structure and all those sorts of things might play into that bird friendliness index more in those sort of strata that have a higher content of grass. Whereas you move in Saskatchewan, for instance, further north and east, keeping habitat intact is maybe going to be the largest driver for the bird friendliness index in some ways, just by virtue of the surrounding sort of landscape, which if there was significant enough economic benefits tied to that, then I think you do start to sort of influence the surrounding landscape in that way by rewarding those biodiversity benefits, right? So by keeping natural habitats intact, there's more economic value there and kind of creates sort of hopefully a positive feedback loop within that. So I don't know, hopefully I'm answering your question, but I guess that's kind of, yeah, the frame of reference that we're coming at it is trying to communicate, you know, what the benefits are and inform some management that way. But yeah,
I mean, that's the idea. I guess I'm in a simple way, I'm just saying, well, if the surround has more potential in situation B, where, you know, I would up the value of the farm index. I'm thinking, do we up the value of the index for that individual farm because it has greater potential for creating more grassland? I mean, bigger in general, I think we think bigger patches of grass are better in the long run.
mm-hmm. Yeah. I see what you're saying. Yeah.
I'll just interject for a second in case anyone else wanted to take a stab at any of those questions. Okay. And I think, Tom, like to your first question as well, we have a whole bunch of new initiatives with Canadian Wildlife Service where we're looking to and have been creating conservation agreements of various types with landowners. And it's really valuable for us to be able to have an index like this so that we can demonstrate the value of the management that's happening on those lands with respect to species at risk and migratory birds. And that, again, helps us to then justify the investments that we're making and to show the positive outcomes for species at risk and biodiversity, which then allows us to, get more funding and continue those programs. And so, we can't just sign these agreements in good faith and have no data at the end to show that we've actually had a positive impact. So there are a lot of sort of really tangible, I think, applications for this type of work that dovetail nicely with a lot of the new initiatives that are happening here. We can go to Ken next, and then there's a bit of a chat happening out there that we can touch on from the chat.
Yeah, thanks. So yeah, first thing I was going to comment on the chat, which is pretty interesting, and I guess follows from one of Tom's earlier points is just this idea of somehow weighting the index by the conservation concern of the species, and that diversity per se, as was noted here, is probably not the best measure for grassland birds. In fact, could be the opposite. At a parcel level, if you're increasing diversity, you could be destroying the habitat for the most important species. So, I mean, you're aware of that, but that's just something to, maybe make explicit in there. But I also wanted to just explore, extend Tom's thinking even more, perhaps, because, in Partners in Flight, we're in the business of taking some of these great ideas and seeing how we might be able to apply them globally or range wide, big scales, in standardized ways. And, you're focusing on the parcels, but I was wondering whether there's a way to use the index, use the same concept of an index, but kind of integrate up to the landscape. And that would incorporate, some of Tom's thinking about matrix and surrounding. And I'm thinking that, for our State of the Birds reports in the US and Canada, we have these long-term indicators. And we say that those indicators, we want those indicators to be, indicators of broader ecosystem function, et cetera, et cetera. And, we're copying this model from the UK of it actually then feeding back into farmland policy and all that stuff. So I'm just wondering whether there's a role for this indicator as some kind of a landscape or even biome-wide indicator that you could track over time. In other words, if the bird friendliness of the entire Canadian grassland beef growing region is going down year by year by you integrating up over all those parcels or pixels, I don't know, that just might be way beyond what you're thinking, but that's the way my mind is going with this, using this kind of an index more broadly and even in other ecosystems.
Well, maybe I'll take a stab here. So I think that's exactly the vision. So the vision is to use this on a really big scale and be able to show changes, over time, as you point out, or say, a certain policy is implemented in this province, but not in this province, and our indicator tells us what effect it has on biodiversity. So I think the limiting factor is only to collect the samples that we need. So as long as you have enough AIUs and enough manpower to analyze the AIUs, or volunteers or qualified staff or whatnot, as long as you have enough sampling that is done, I think you can go as large as you like. And the other thing that I do want to mention is the index was developed for grassland birds in the prairies, but it can be done for any working landscape. So you just need to swap out the indicator species. And so now you are looking at Northern Ontario, the boreal or whatnot, but it's not, you can do it anywhere with any bird community. So I'm glad you brought this up. That is exactly the idea. And while I'm talking, I'm going to ask a question myself. If any of you are involved in the discussions on the halt and reverse biodiversity policy within ECCC, we would love to talk, because we think there is a role for this kind of indicator in figuring out whether the government policy actually has the desired effect. So again, if this is like big picture, big vision, but I think it has the potential to help us understand these questions.
A follow-up question then, that's great to hear. I mean, if the limiting factor you said is collecting the data, and for everything we've heard about, how expensive and difficult it is to monitor these sites year after year, and in places like Mexico, and some of you know where I'm going to go with this comment, a heretical suggestion is to think now about ways of applying eBird data and ways of improving the collection of eBird data, perhaps as a way of getting that more, standardized across all birds and all landscapes, in a way of apply, and how, even though it might not be the ideal data going in, but how could you apply those models that are now available for all those species and all those areas to this kind of an index idea? And if that would work. And I think there'd probably be people interested in collaborating on that.
We have talked about using eBird to improve the models. I won't say anything because I'm not up to speed, but maybe Barry can talk.
Yeah, I knew Barry would comment.
Yeah, I mean, eBird would be, I think with the new products coming out of eBird are great, and there's a lot of potential there. But the problem is, if you look at these remote native grasslands, really all the eBird checklists that have been submitted are by our staff, essentially, because there's just no public access. There's no desire to go to these areas. There's, they're often on private lands. And if you look at the new trend analysis by eBird, none of the grassland obligates that we're concerned about have trend estimates, because there just simply isn't data from eBird. So that's the problem. And that's what stimulated me to start my off-road grassland bird monitoring program in Canada, which is essentially trying to replicate IMBCR, is because, even BBS doesn't, in my opinion, survey these large intact native grasslands. And the trend estimates we get from grassland species from BBS are really talking about populations that live at the periphery of the grassland cropland interface. So yeah, I just think it would be a huge amount of work to try and get volunteers into these areas to try and get, citizen science data.
But correct me if I'm wrong, sort of, Barry, like through our initial discussions, like you could generate essentially a landscape bird friendliness index based on your models or some sort of basis of your models. Is that correct?
Yeah, and so that's the other potential, is to use the modeled density, right? Because from our models we have a prediction of density for, I can't remember how many species now, 50 some odd species for every 800 meter pixel across the landscape. So yeah, in theory we could do that, and those are extrapolated to the year. So yeah, we just have to explore, how much do we trust the models, maybe do a little bit more. I think we've been talking a lot about the need to ground truth my density estimates. That's something that Janine and I have been talking about, implementing a protocol this summer where we actually, do spot mapping or estimate, try and find every single nest in a certain quarter section or whatever, and to try and actually ground truth our density estimates. I think those things I would want to do first before we, go too far down relying on the density models. But yeah.
Any other questions, comments? And I guess so, Silke, coming back to your question about if anybody here is involved in sort of some of the larger environment and climate change Canada biodiversity monitoring and assessment pieces, like I guess I'll spin that back to Barry. How connected are you with the work that's being done for the agricultural sector work? And I know Robin Bloom has done a whole bunch of work on developing indicators for the ag sector work. I'm presuming that he's been looped into this work as well.
Yeah, actually, a lot of the funding that Silke just mentioned that they got till 2025, and the previous funding all comes from Carl Zimmer's, who's Robin's manager. They call that funding does come from them, and a lot of the desire for ECCC to fund this work is to do just what you were talking about, Ellen, in terms of like trying to quantify the benefit of all these different funding programs that we're providing to landowners. So that's definitely why we're interested in it, or one reason why we're interested in it. And yeah, so certainly the Robin Bloom and all of Carl Zimmer's team are looped into this, and are a lot of we talk to them a lot about what would you like to see out of the BFI, for example. So those are conversations we have ongoing.
Okay, great, that's good. All right, any other questions or thoughts before we can release Silke and Ian if they'd like? You're welcome to stick around, but I presume you wouldn't want to.
No, we are happy to share the slide deck if you wish, if that's useful. And, we are happy to engage in this discussion anytime. As I said, it's dear to our hearts. And we do hope it will turn into a tool that is actually used to measure large-scale impact. So that's our vision. It'll take a little bit of time, but hopefully we'll get there. And again, without Barry and Janine, we wouldn't be here. So thank you again. And thank you all for your attention. It's been great.
Thanks. So Tom has a interjection.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate, you're developing an outcome-based tool. I mean, and the question came up, can we do this by just looking at management? But ultimately, we really want to see if something works for birds. So, and I wish we could see 10 years in the future, and we can also do all the studies that are necessary to monitor the effectiveness of the use of the tool and all that kind of stuff. So we could really, this works, and, and bring in sociologists and monitor the effectiveness of the way in which this tool and our agencies interact with private industry to move conservation forward. So there's just so much that needs to be done to make this work at large scales. It's daunting, actually. But again, I laud the idea of using some sort of outcome-based monitoring and bird populations, of course, because I care about birds. So good job. Keep it going.
Yeah, it's all very cool. Thank you for sharing.
Thank you.
Great.
See you all
Thanks.
later.
So we will share the recording of this with the PIF Science group. And if you can send me your presentation, I'll share that as well. We really appreciate you taking the time today to come and present to us, and look forward to continuing to support this work however we can.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Thanks,
Bye.
everyone.
All right.
Hey, Elaine, I'm going to interrupt with a little story.
Go ahead.
So I had resisted putting a bird feeder in my backyard for a long time for a variety of reasons. And now I have handmade suet on a pole, a little skinny pole, but the squirrels were driving me crazy, of course. And I figured out an ingenious way to defeat them. And that is I put a big pile of cracked corn under the feeder, and now they're too fat to climb the pole.
So
I don't know why I didn't think of that sooner.
you need long-term monitoring, though, because soon those fat squirrels are going to produce a lot of skinny squirrels.
That's absolutely true. It works now, but not after the breeding season.
Anything we can do to defeat squirrels, I'm all ears. I've given up. And Ken just saw yesterday a squirrel. How far did the squirrel leap? 8 feet to get up?
Yeah, I was wondering how are they getting up there? And I watched them climb this little shrub, and then he kind of used the momentum of the branch to just kind of